I grew up in a very religious, conservative, and traditional household in rural Georgia. I practically lived and breathed my church, and only ever attended private schools, all the way up until I graduated. Part of the curriculum, in order to graduate from my high school, was going on a missionary trip. After a hurricane down in Florida, my school gave us the opportunity to volunteer to help feed those who were now homeless from their houses being destroyed. Most of my class, myself included, decided to go and help out. We took a bus down to an old mansion that my school had rented out. It was just far enough away from the storm to be able to not have to been touched by it. So despite its age, it was in pretty solid condition. Working electricity, plumbing, it even had air conditioning, and so forth. I was told that it was usually rented out as a venue for things like weddings, but the landowner had appreciated the school's thoughtfulness so much that he gave them a huge discount. The staff also figured keeping every kid in one area would ultimately be cheaper and easier to pull off, instead of stuffing us in multiple rooms across a hotel. All in all, I was pretty excited to check the place out. When we arrived, we were greeted by a huge lawn in which a backyard bordered a swamp. The yard had a shed, a swing set, and a garden, which included benches to sit under the trees that were there within it. The inside of the mansion was very open and bright, the reminiscent of Greek architecture. It had lots of fireplaces and somewhat unnerving statues. The bedrooms housed up to 6 people each and had strange paintings on the walls. The place even had an indoor pool, although we weren't allowed to swim in it, mostly because the adults didn't want to deal with boys and girls being scantily clad within close quarters atop of having to make sure nobody drowned. We had pretty basic rules, and a schedule relayed to us. No sneaking off, no swimming in the swamp or pool, no boys and girls' bedrooms, and vice versa, no stealing food from the kitchen, no sleeping in, and so forth. Our schedule consisted of waking up at 7:30, breakfast at 8, volunteering from 9 to 3 with a 45-minute break in between, dinner at 4, lessons from 5 to 7, being allowed to use our cell phone from 7 to 8:30, and lights out by 9. We'd start volunteering the following morning, and dinner was being prepared for us kids, so we had time to kill. While we weren't allowed to swim in the swamp, the adults didn't have a problem with us fishing in it. So, my friend and I, let's call him Sam, had brought some gear along with us to see what we could catch. A girl we knew, we'll call her Jasmine, decided to join us and talk to us while we did our thing. She mostly talked to Sam, as I have a tendency to zone out when I'm doing mundane tasks. We ended up catching a couple things, but released them back into the water, just as we were about to finish up. Jasmine pointed out a strange shape that just poked up out of the water. My vision has always been kind of bad, and I forgot to bring my glasses on the trip. So at first I thought it was a rock, but then I realized it was a crocodile. We watched it for a minute or so, before collectively agreeing to not tell any of the staff, as to not risk any more restrictions. We soon had dinner, and afterwards, Sam pulled me aside and said he wanted to wrestle the crocodile into submission in order to impress Jasmine. We were still very early in high school and only 14, so for a boy his age to have such ideas, while stupid, wasn't unheard of. Even though I was the same age, by that point I knew better, and I called him an idiot. He called me a wimp. I told him Jasmine would think he was stupid, but he insisted that she wouldn't, and so on. We went back and forth for a bit, but neither of us budged on our positions, and our conversation died by the time it was time for lessons. He didn't bring it up the following day while at breakfast or volunteering, so I figured he must have either changed his mind or simply forgot. It wasn't until the bus brought us back to the mansion that I lose track of Sam. I found him by the swamp with Jasmine, and he was letting her fish with his gear. I went over to join them, and for a few minutes, nothing happened until Jasmine mentioned spotting the crocodile again. It was swimming to the left of us. That is when Sam brought up his bold idea of wrestling the crocodile once more. Jasmine just laughed, not taking him very seriously at first, but then he began to follow the crocodile down its path. I once again tried to convince Sam that he was an idiot, and both Jasmine and I chased after him. We were beginning to stray pretty far from the property, to the point that we had to make our way through some wild, unkempt forestry. I knew that if we were gone too long, we could get into serious trouble. Sam stopped to pick something off the ground, and by the time we caught up to him, he'd thrown it into the water. It missed the crocodile, but seemed to get its attention. Both Jasmine and I were begging him to knock it off. He picked up his stick and told us to take it easy, and threw it. I tried to stop him, but couldn't block it in time. This time, it did hit the crocodile. Its head poked from the water, and it hissed at us. I screamed to Sam that he pissed it off and we needed to leave. But before any of us knew it, it descended from the water in a completely upright manner. The swamp couldn't have been more than a few feet deep, and we could see the upper half of this thing's body. It had a toned humanoid shape, despite being covered in dark green scales. It began to trudge through the marsh, hissing all the while. I caught glimpses of its lower arms, which seemed nearly long enough to go down to its knees, as they would on a person. Like I said, I don't have great vision, but its hands looked to be very similar to the shape of a person's, except they had long, black nails on the ends of them, nearly qualifying as claws. We screamed and ran off, trying to make our way through the shrubbery in order to get back onto the property. We yelled, warning everybody outside about the nearby monster, and most people just looked at us in confusion. Past the forestry, it let out another hiss. Some heard it, and others did not, causing only more confusion. One of the adults nearby ushered us inside, and after a couple of minutes of gathering everybody, they began counting heads. Once it was confirmed we were all inside, Sam, Jasmine, and I began to get questioned about what we saw. We repeated what we had already said. Most people had their own opinions and comments on the matter, but they were shushed. The adults didn't know what to think. They weren't sure if we were just pulling the prank. We stressed that we weren't. One of them pointed out that regardless of our specific story, a part of it wasn't true. She did hear the hiss of a crocodile in the nearby marsh, meaning that there was definitely one out there. One of the more superstitious, older staff members did believe us, and presumed that the crocodile was an evil spirit. They debated calling the police, and at this point, many students were demanding to have their phones so they could call their parents. I knew it was going to be a long night, so I just laid in my bed upstairs. We ended up being kept inside the rest of the day, and it had an hour-long prayer session solely dedicated to banishing the spirit, cutting into half of our lesson time. I couldn't tell which I'd rather do, if I'm being honest. I was still making sense of the creature myself, and trying to come to a conclusion of what exactly I saw. The next morning, I woke up to some ruckus going on downstairs. Apparently, while checking out the area at dawn to make sure it was safe, one of the staff members saw the crocodile in the distance. She said it stood at about 7 to 8 feet tall. Its body looked like a malformed person's, with its bones jutting out at strange angles. As the day went on, we skipped going to volunteer, as the adults figured out what to do. They ended up letting us have our cell phones back, and called the landowner in a nearby hotel to try and move us instead. Around evening, we were all ushered into the bus and driven off to a hotel, about 30 miles away. Once we got there, some parents had driven down to pick up their kids, Jasmine's parents included, but otherwise the mission trip was going to resume as usual once we all got settled in. I gave Sam some crap about how he had ruined both the mission trip and his own chance to get with Jasmine, but I figured that the incident alone was enough of a lesson for him not to mess with wild animals. The rest of the trip resumed as normal. although the crocodile was basically the main talk amongst us kids the entire time. Because one of the staff members saw the monster for herself, most of the adults had believed it was some sort of demonic entity by that point. So, we were often shushed and even punished if we were caught discussing the thing. Some kids had their phones taken away for the rest of the trip as well, and some would have detention upon returning to school. The staff were worried we'd attract its attention and potentially even risk it following us back to Georgia. Of course, being forbidden from chatting about it made us want to talk about it even more. Now, it's been a long time since this event, and I've had a lot of time to sit on my thoughts regarding the whole matter. These days, I don't consider myself as deeply religious or conservative as the way I was raised, but I still am a Christian and am active in my local church and community. I have told my story to many people within its sense, and while some believe it was some sort of demon, most seem to figure it was simply a bizarre living creature that's from this earth. That's the conclusion I've come to as well. I've been down to Florida many times since then, a few times not even being too far off from the location of said mansion. I have never seen anything like it since. I mean, not that I particularly wish to.